welcome again to UFOnaut Australia. We have a guest with us today, a very special guest who was in the Westall 66 movie, which was recently put out by Rosie Jones. You probably already figured out who that is, and that is Shane Ryan. Hi Shane, and welcome to the show.
Hello Andrew, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
That's great.
It's great to meet you.
Yeah, you too. Finally we catch up.
That's right.
That's good. Last night we had the conference here in Adelaide, which we both presented at.
Yes.
That was a great event, yeah?
It was fantastic. You know, it was great to have so many people come along who were really thirsty to get more information about these great historical UFO, flying saucer incidents that we have from Australia. I think people in Australia often get inundated, you know, particularly people who have an interest in the UFO phenomena, inundated with cases from overseas, the more famous cases perhaps from North America and so on. I like to go in to bat for the cases that we have from Australia, because we have these wonderful homegrown Australian flying saucer stories.
There's a lot of them, isn't there?
There's a lot of them that I think need a better airing.
And so obviously the Westall case is your pet. I suppose that's the best way to put it. It's one that you've looked into the most. How did you initially get involved with looking at Westall, considering, you know, I know you came originally from Victoria, but how did you get involved with Westall?
Well, initially I moved down to Melbourne to go to university. I come from a place called Shepparton in Victoria originally, and I lived with a lady who had been in that part of Melbourne, the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, around the city of Waverley, as it was called back then, for a very long time, and she told me about this story about a flying saucer that had landed at Westall. And it was a story that she'd heard from acquaintances who lived closer to Westall. And so we talked about it, and I can remember going on a short road trip from Mulgrave, where I was living, out to Westall and having a drive around and thinking, okay, this is where it happened. Looked like a pretty unlikely place for a flying saucer event to have happened.
It does very
but
much so.
Of course it looks a little bit different now compared to how it did back in 1966. And then we went home, and I really then proceeded to forget all about it until some years later, about 2005 in fact, and I was looking around for an idea, a subject to write a book for kids. And it dawned on me, and I still don't know.
Like a children's story, or?
Well, a book, I guess.
Or an educational kind of?
No, more a book of fiction.
Okay.
You know, a book of fiction, but based on a true story. For kids, and I don't know why the Westall story came into my mind, but it did. And I realised that the 40th anniversary of the story was coming up the following year in 2006. So I thought, well, I'll do a little bit of initial research into this and see if it's going to be worthwhile as a foundation for a book of fiction for kids.
So you had to look at it and see if there was enough substance in it that you could do a story.
That's right.
Like that.
Enough substance, enough information, enough in the way of sources that would sustain that. And as I began that process, I started making contact with people who had been kids at Westall, people who were now in their 50s, and I chatted to them, and almost to a person they were keen to talk to me about what had happened. And not just keen, but they were, what's the word? They were flabbergasted in a way that somebody, after all these years, the passage of time, was showing interest in something that not only had happened so long ago, but something which they'd been discouraged from talking about. And if they had tried to talk about it at the time or later on, they were often met with a brick wall or looks of disdain, or they learned very quickly it was best not to talk about it. But I was keen for them to talk about it, and I was happy to listen to their story. And so they were very encouraging and very supportive. And that number of people that I got in contact with grew over the months. And I think in a way I became, what's the word? I became so interested in the story as a story, because I think so many people were telling me what was self-evidently the same story. Sure, they were telling it to me from a slightly different perspective, depending on what age they were and where they were standing and what time they came onto the scene, but essentially it was the same story.
So the general consensus was the same story right through. It was just variations of that particular story then.
That's right. Yeah. And I became convinced of the fact that this was a true story that had actually happened, and that there were even elements to the story more interesting than I had originally anticipated.
So let me ask you a quick question then. If you've interviewed various peoples in those early times when you're first starting to look at it, did those people actually know each other at the time so they couldn't, let's say, join their stories together and say, oh, well, I saw this and you say the same thing and we'll be right? They didn't know each other to do that?
No. I mean, most of these people, almost to a person, there were a few exceptions, but most of these people had had next to no contact with each other for decades. There were some who maintained friendships, but even for those people who maintained friendships, and often it was only with, say, one or two other people, they saw each other reasonably rarely. Perhaps they hadn't seen each other for a few years. And when they did make contact with each other over that time, it wasn't the Westall flying saucer story that they talked about. It was just more
general life stuff,
ordinary stuff. Catching up on what had happened in the
what
preceding
I've been doing
years.
the last few months.
Absolutely.
Or whatever.
So the notion that they had been talking about this over time, or once I'd contacted one person, they then contacted a few friends and said, let's get our story right about this flying saucer event, was nothing like that. Nothing like that. I mean, these people, very ordinary, down-to-earth, lovely people who were happy to share this extraordinary event, this unexpected event, which had happened, broken into their lives one day, was not something that they had anticipated. It happened to them. And of course it was very short-lived. I mean, it was something which was only spread over a few minutes or a few hours. And yet it was something which stayed with them all their lives.
All their lives, And so I suppose if that's the situation, all of a sudden they thought it had all really much gone quiet because no one was interested to talk about it. Along came Shane Ryan to ask him a few questions, and their life's now topsy-turvy all over again. And probably a lot of memories come flooding back with a lot of those people that, they're sitting there listening to other people's stories now and thinking, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot about that particular part of the story.
That's right. And memory is such a tricky thing, of course. We all know that from our own lives, and I think most people realise that whenever we remember something, if you sort of literally look at that word remember, it's remember. We're taking bits of a whole, the members of a whole, and trying to put them back together again. And every time that we do that, of course, we remember it in a slightly different way, and we change it. And no one can ever go back and capture something that happened so long ago perfectly. And I think we all understand that. And that's why, for me, it was important that I not limit my approach to witnesses to a few, excuse me, but to try to approach as many people as possible. Because this was a big story that affected a large number of people, and I felt to get a handle on it in as correct and as full a way as possible, I needed to contact as many people as possible, including the people who, for which it was nothing. They remembered almost nothing of that story. Or, yes, they were there that day, they vaguely remembered something, but they kept reading the book that they were reading, or they were playing on the other side of the playground, and it didn't involve them.
They didn't really take a lot of notice, basically.
That's right. And there were those people as well, as you would expect in any given situation.
With regressional work and things like that, we know that when somebody's had an encounter or an abduction or an experience, they go and see somebody who can do a regression, such as Mary Rodwell or whoever it might be. Did you guys ever go down that track with any of the witnesses to see if we could go back in time through a regression to see if there's any more evidence that could come forward for that?
Well, I didn't do that personally. It's not something that I have any personal expertise in, of course, and I'm very conscious of all of the difficulties that surround those sort of techniques.
Yep.
They're often not particularly straightforward, and it's not something that I've ever suggested to people.
Yep.
I am aware that there was one witness, possibly another, who did take themselves off quite independently just to have a bit of hypnotism done. And one of those people is featured in the documentary, visiting a hypnotherapist, just to try to get for her personally a better handle on her memories, to try to get a greater clarity over what she experienced that day.
And what came
it's
out
not
of
regression.
What came out of that? Was there anything that you learned from that?
Well, for her,
or she learned from that?
That's right. She had a couple of visits to that particular hypnotherapist, I believe, and she got a little bit more clarity around the memories, the visualization of what she could see.
Yeah.
I think she got a greater clarity around that. A greater sense of what was going on around her as she was running across the sports ground, who she could see around her, what she could see in the sky. I don't think it was perfect or complete, but I think it helped her a little. Now, of course, there may be other people that I don't know about, who I've never been in contact with, who have availed themselves of such services. I just don't know.
Now, you run a Facebook page specifically for Westall people that were there at the time.
That's right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
I do, but I probably should backtrack a little bit and go back to the original webpage that I set up before I even knew about Facebook. In fact, I think before Facebook even existed, and that was using Yahoo Groups. And so I set up a Yahoo Groups website in 2005.
Is that still running?
It's still running. Absolutely.
Listen up, folks.
Yeah, it's going well. It was fantastic because even though in a sense these sort of websites have been a little bit surpassed now by things like Facebook, they still serve a really useful purpose. And the purpose it served initially was to gain a web presence and provide a forum for people who had access to the internet to come on and just share their memories. To say, I was at Westall that day, or I knew somebody who was at Westall that day, and to share their memories, share their stories. So it provided a place for people to connect with each other.
Was there many people on that site?
It started off, as all these things do, very slowly, and then built up gradually. And of course it attracted people who weren't involved with Westall, but had an interest in Westall, a bit like me, as well as people who were actually there. And that was very useful, and I was able, of course, to use that particular Yahoo Groups website to put up onto the internet all those things that were connected with the Westall incident, like the original newspaper articles, the original map from the 1966 Melway Melbourne Street Directory. 1966 was the first year Melway published its street directory of the Westall area.
We were lucky for that one.
We were very lucky, weren't we? Timing. The aerial photography that I was able to procure rather. There was one from 1966, another one from 1968, showing the Westall area. All those sorts of things as extra resources, if you like. So that was useful, but that then led on in a few years later to developing a Facebook page for the Westall Flying Saucer incident. Again, simply another forum to provide a place for people to share their memories. Again, you can upload all sorts of things like photos and articles and maps. And it also opened the incident up to a wider audience. So it's attracted people again who weren't connected to the Westall incident, but again have some sort of interest in the story.
Because there'll be a few people out there, or maybe a lot of people out there that were connected that still don't know. They don't know that you've done the episode on Westall 66 because for whatever reason they don't watch the Sci-Fi Channel or they don't watch TV, and so they may be somebody who just breezes through their computer at their local library, come across your site and bang, there you go, you've got some new people that you didn't know about before. So that can be very handy, can't it?
It can be extremely handy. I mean, any publicity for something like this is going to be useful, up to a point. Useful especially in terms of reaching out to people who have knowledge about the story. And I'm very conscious of the fact that there were about 450 students at Westall High School that year. I've been in contact with about 150 of them. So only about a third. And that's after 7 years of trying. These things are really, really hard to do.
It's a really hard thing to do, isn't it? I know with what we do with our research, it's always very difficult to get to the nuts and the bolts of people that are out there that,
That's right.
you know, you don't know where they are. They're very hard to track down.
Very hard to track down, and you rely on things like, which is why I mentioned the media publicity, you rely on things like having an article in a newspaper. And I've been very fortunate. One of the very first things I did, along with starting the Yahoo Group's website, was to contact a couple of local newspapers, local to the Westall area.
Yes.
And contact them and say, this is who I am, this is the story I'm interested in. I wonder if any of your readers might remember this thing happening all those years ago. And those articles ran in those newspapers, and lo and behold, people read them, and they were read by people who did remember, and then they contacted me. And that then led on to a little bit more publicity, another article, and so it mushroomed a little in that way.
Yeah.
But I think that's what you have to do. You have to try to get the word out there. Otherwise, it's a really hard ask to contact people after 46 years, as it is now, because people, particularly in a country like Australia, they spread out, they change their names. You need to do everything you can to contact people.
It's a real race against time to some extent, isn't it?
It's a race against time.
And just moving on slightly from there, when we did our previous short episode on Westall, we were at the Grange, and we were walking through, and we came across a couple of elderly gentlemen. They looked like they were local, so we asked them a couple of questions on it, and they'd actually never heard of it, and they'd lived in the area forever. And so it just goes to show how hard it is to get that word out, that some people don't even know that it existed, and they lived right there. So it's very difficult in that respect.
Well, in many ways, it's like oral history, any sort of oral history or local history. It's very, very precious. And we lose so much history when people die, when people move away, and we're losing history that's really important. You know, not just personal history, but history about things that have happened in the neighbourhood, and sometimes history about extraordinary things that have happened in a neighbourhood, like what happened at Westall.
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of stories around, other than this UFO case, that have similar ramifications where things have happened and people don't even realise that they've moved into the area. They're new to the area, and they don't realise that just around the corner there could have been some huge incident that happened that could be relevant to them.
That's right.
Just moving on a little bit from there, we really would like to try and help you out a little bit here, Shane, because we discussed yesterday about the light aircraft that were flying overhead at the time, and we're talking about how hard it is to get the message out there. This medium here providing the video to everybody to see now, it's very difficult to find out about the aircraft that supposedly flew across at the time. I know from our efforts we've never really got anywhere with it. Maybe we could just touch a little bit on that, and whether you've had any luck there, or whether you want to tell the audience if there's anything that they have, how they contact you.
Well, I'd like to make a direct appeal down the lens of that camera over there and through this microphone to anybody who has any information about the aeroplanes that were associated with the flying saucer at Westall. You see, the original newspaper accounts and the accounts of so many of the witnesses that I've been able to gather over these past few years tell the story of 5 light aircraft somehow being associated with the flying saucer. What I mean is the students and the teachers at Westall High School and the state school next door were very, very familiar with aeroplanes. You couldn't visit Westall, you still can't visit Westall and not notice the buzz of aeroplanes in the air from nearby Moorabbin Airport. It's constant.
It's very close, isn't it?
And it was, it's been a very busy airport for a very long time.
Yep.
It was the second busiest airport in Victoria, I think, for a very long time.
Yep.
So a lot of aircraft, a lot of the time. And when these 5 light aircraft, and most people remember them as being Cessnas or Cessna type aircraft, they identified them very clearly, very quickly, and knew straight away that they were planes and this other thing clearly wasn't. But there seemed to be some connection, some interplay between the two, as if the planes were trying to observe the flying saucer, or trying to keep up with it, or trying to chase it. The original newspaper articles in the Dandenong Journal quote a witness talking about it as if they were playing a game of cat and mouse.
So where did the story of the planes come from? Was it from some of the students, or was it directly from the newspapers?
It was in the newspapers, and it was in the newspapers because it came from the witnesses.
Okay.
And one of the witnesses was Mr. Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher, and some of the students that the Dandenong Journal reporter, Des Carroll, interviewed at the time. So that's where it came from originally. And of course, as I've contacted witness after witness, I've put the notion, the story of there being aeroplanes to them after a while, after having a bit of a chat to them. Some people don't recall it. Lots of people do. Lots of people say there were planes, can't quite remember how many. Some put a figure on it. People usually say something like 3 or 4 or 5 planes. And they're quite clear about the fact that they were planes, just ordinary sort of planes. As if they'd come from an ordinary sort of place like Moorabbin Airport. And even though they were used to aeroplanes being in the air all the time, and of course planes are doing circuit and bumps manoeuvres all the time, they don't do it as a group together. You don't get 5 aeroplanes doing circuits and bumps together.
No.
They're not coming in as if to touch down on the runway and then lifting off again together. And it was very unusual to see 5 aeroplanes so close together near the school. And so that's why for the witnesses, for them, the link between the planes and whatever this was that they saw in the sky, this thing that they described as a flying saucer, seemed so obvious. It wasn't as if they were seeing 1 or 2 planes in the background
it was like chalk
doing
and
their
cheese,
usual
basically.
work.
They didn't look anything like a light aircraft, basically. That was the difference. And
That's
I suppose having those aeroplanes there gave it some sort of clarity as to the fact that it wasn't an aircraft, because it did look so very different to what aircraft do look like.
That's right. And there was one pilot who was associated with a plane that was up at the time from Moorabbin Airport, not necessarily one of those 5 planes that was seen. And his name was mentioned in the original Dandenong Journal articles, and he was asked about it at the time, and he said, yes, I was up, I was flying my plane, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Now, we were able to track his widow down. He'd passed away. And she amazingly remembered the story. And she could remember her husband, her late husband, being asked about it. And him saying, as he did at the time, I was flying and I didn't see anything. Now, who was actually in those 5 planes? We just don't know. But we would love to know, because whoever they were, they had a wonderful view of whatever it was flying over Westall that day, and possibly was somehow linked with it.
So there you go, folks. So if there is anybody out there that did see those planes on that particular day, or even if you're one of the pilots, Shane would absolutely love to talk to you about that. You can come anonymously, or if you're not so unhappy about that and you're quite happy to bring your name along and talk to Shane, I'm sure he'd be most welcome to talk to you about it. All right, I think we've probably covered a fair bit. Is there anything else that you would like to tell us about other than Westall at this point in time?
Well, just want to say to people that the Westall research is very much ongoing. The television documentary was completed and has been broadcast on TV. But the actual research is very much ongoing, and for me, even though when I first started, I really thought I'd probably be able to crack the Westall mystery within about 12 months or so, and I wouldn't have been at all surprised.
That would have been nice.
It would have been nice. Don't we all think that at the beginning?
Yeah.
And I wouldn't have at all been surprised
Yeah.
if I'd found a very prosaic, ordinary explanation to what it was. But I haven't.
No.
But I'm still looking for that prosaic, ordinary explanation, and I'm still absolutely open to it. But I just have to match that explanation with the descriptions, the experiences of the people who, unlike me, were there that day. So it's an ongoing thing. It may be a lifelong task.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but
it can happen.
it can happen, can't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
And just for people to look at the Westall story and to remember, we have these wonderful stories in Australia. There's nothing wrong with looking at stories overseas, but at the same time to recognise we have great homegrown stories, and a lot of those homegrown stories really deserve to be looked at again and to be examined again in finer detail.
And we'd encourage anybody out there who has their own story to come forward to our group, and you can drop us an email. The email addresses are on the website, or you can post something to us. The post office box is on the main page of the website. So if you've got some story that you want to talk to us about, we're very happy to talk to you about it. And if you've got anything in relation to the Westall story, then I'm sure Shane would be most welcome to hear from you as well.
And you can always directly contact me either through the Westall Flying Saucer Incident Facebook page or through the Yahoo Groups page. And also, of course, the film has its own website, being www.westall66ufo.com.au, and you can certainly contact me through that website as well.
Excellent. All right, that's terrific. I thank you for your time. It's
Thank
been
you,
a great
Andrew.
weekend, and we've had a good time here in Adelaide, and hopefully we'll catch up again soon. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.